I've always loved camping. There's something magical about being surrounded by nature. But that love quickly turned into a nightmare one evening in the woods with friends. We set out on a Friday afternoon, excited for a weekend filled with hiking, stories around the fire, and the thrill of the great outdoors. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we settled around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and laughing until the flames flickered low. Just as we finished our last story, my friend Yena suggested we take a nighttime walk. The idea sparked a mix of fear and excitement, especially after our spooky tales. I hesitated but finally agreed. Matt and Aaron, ever the adventurers, quickly jumped on board. We grabbed our flashlights and headed into the dark woods, the beam of light cutting through the thick night air. The woods felt alive. The rustling leaves and occasional snaps of twigs beneath our feet heightened our senses. We wandered deeper, the shadows becoming more oppressive. Then, we heard a faint noise in the distance. It sounded like chains dragging along the ground. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances. I laughed it off, but the sound grew louder, echoing through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, we spotted flickering lights moving through the trees. My heart raced as I felt a primal instinct to run, but Yena urged us to hide behind a nearby bush. We ducked down, breathing heavily as the lights drew nearer. My hands trembled as I clutched my flashlight, its beam wavering in the growing tension. As the figures emerged from the darkness, I felt a chill sweep over me. There were 6 of them, all wearing tattered clothing and pale, expressionless masks. Each held a lantern that illuminated their chained bodies, the metal clanking rhythmically as they moved. I felt frozen, unable to look away from the horrific sight. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? They passed us by, marching slowly in a single file. I could see their feet dragging, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I struggled to convince myself this was real. My friends were just as paralyzed with fear. The sound of chains rattling filled the air as they continued deeper into the woods, the lanterns flickering like distant stars. Once the figures disappeared, we stumbled back to our campsite, too frightened to speak. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, and we huddled close together, trying to shake off the fear. The night dragged on, each crack of a branch sending us into fits of panic. Sleep was impossible, but as the dawn broke, we finally felt safe enough to check on our camp. As we approached the site, a sense of dread washed over me. Our campsite looked different. The tents were askew, and the fire pit was smoldering. I stepped closer, my heart racing. In the dirt beside the fire, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A message was etched into the ground, clear as day: "We will find you." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The terror from the night before flooded back. I turned to my friends, and their faces mirrored my own fear. We needed to leave. We hurriedly packed our things, our hands trembling as we stuffed sleeping bags and food into our packs. I glanced back at the campsite one last time, and that's when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, still wearing the mask, illuminated by the morning sun. It didn't move, just stood there watching us with an eerie stillness. I felt a surge of panic and grabbed Gina's arm. We ran to the car, our hearts pounding in unison, and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe again. The fear began to ebb, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we reached the highway, I turned around to look back at the woods one last time. To my horror, there was a row of flickering lanterns in the distance, standing still against the backdrop of the trees. The memory of that night still haunts me. I can never explain what we saw, but I know one thing for sure: the woods hold secrets that should never be disturbed, and some things are better left in the dark. The sun was setting as we arrived at our camping spot deep in the woods. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of our daily lives. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for a cozy night under the stars. As the darkness enveloped us, we shared stories and laughter, the flickering flames creating an inviting warmth. After a few hours, the conversation turned toward the strange occurrences that supposedly haunted the woods. My friend Sarah spoke up, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. She had heard rumors of people disappearing in these woods, only to reappear days later, babbling about things they had seen. We laughed it off, our spirits too high to let fear creep in. But the atmosphere shifted when a low, guttural growl pierced the night, freezing us in our seats. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We decided to investigate the source of the noise. Flashlights in hand, we trudged deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us. The further we walked, the more the sounds intensified, a mix of rustling leaves and soft whispers that sent chills down my spine. It felt like we were being watched, and every instinct screamed for us to turn back. As we ventured on, we stumbled upon a clearing illuminated by a pale moon. In the center stood a strange, decrepit tree that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Its gnarled branches twisted skyward like skeletal fingers, and the air around it felt heavy with dread. Suddenly, another growl echoed from behind us, closer this time. Panic surged through us, and we sprinted back toward the campsite. We reached our tents, hearts racing, and tried to shake off the unease. We huddled around the fire, recounting our experience. Laughter returned, but the atmosphere was different now. The woods felt alive, watching us. Just as we began to settle down, the growling returned, this time louder and more aggressive. It was as if something was angry we had intruded on its territory. Fearing for our safety, we decided to barricade ourselves inside our tents for the night. The growling continued, mixing with strange, unintelligible whispers that seemed to surround us. I could hear my friend's shallow breaths, the tension palpable in the air. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just the woods playing tricks on us, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the world outside. Then, just as I thought I might drift off, a loud crash echoed through the darkness, followed by frantic wrestling. I shot upright, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I could hear my friends whispering, their voices laced with panic. Suddenly, the tent flaps burst open, and Sarah stumbled inside, her face pale and wild. "It's out there," she gasped. "We need to go now." Before we could ask what she meant, she froze, eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. Outside, silhouetted against the moonlight, were three figures, each wearing tattered clothing and long hair that hung in front of their faces. They stood motionless, staring directly at us, their bodies swaying as if caught in some unseen breeze. I could hardly breathe as I realized they were not human. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and disjointed. Before we could react, one of the figures let out a high-pitched screech that sent shockwaves of fear through me. I grabbed my friends, pulling them down to the ground as the figures began to move toward us, each step deliberate and slow. As they approached, a wave of darkness seemed to envelop them, making it hard to see clearly. I felt a pull, as if they were beckoning me to join them. My mind raced with terror, but in that moment, a strange calm washed over me. I could hear them whispering, their voices sweet and soothing, promising safety and comfort. Then, just as abruptly, the figures stopped, their heads jerking back as if sensing something. In an instant, they turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had come. We remained frozen, too terrified to speak. When dawn broke, we gathered our things, the fear still thick in the air. As we packed up, I noticed something etched into the dirt by our fire pit. The words read, "We will find you when the moon rises again." We rushed back to our car, glancing over our shoulders, every rustle in the trees igniting panic. We drove away in silence, a sense of dread lingering as we left the woods behind. Little did we know, those figures were not gone. They had simply retreated, watching, waiting for the night to claim us once more. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. Is that a person? Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. What was that thing? He gasped. I don't know, but we should pack up and leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. The fire, he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. What the hell? Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. Get away from the fire, I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story had heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the noise of the city and unwind in nature with my friends. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or cabins. Just the four of us, me, Alex, Jenna, and Marcus. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, the atmosphere filled with laughter as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness enveloped the camp, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories that ranged from silly to spine-chilling. I felt a warm glow inside as I watched my friends enjoy the night, but it didn't last long. Alex suggested we play a game of truth or dare. I remember feeling a little uneasy about it. Something about the looming trees seemed to echo our laughter, almost mocking it. When it was my turn, I chose truth. I was asked about my biggest fear. I shared that I was terrified of being lost in the woods, alone and unable to find my way back. They laughed it off, but as I looked into the darkened tree line, I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine. After the game, Jenna suggested a night hike. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be a fun adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a narrow path surrounded by thick trees. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. At first, we walked in jovial spirits, joking and laughing. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak ominously. The sound of rustling leaves became unnaturally loud. I started to feel anxious, and I glanced around, noticing the darkness felt thicker here. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a distant, strange sound like metal scraping against metal. My heart raced. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask my fear. The others nodded, their faces pale. We decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As we crept forward, the noise grew louder. It wasn't just one sound, but a symphony of clanging and thudding, echoing through the trees. The lights from our flashlights flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to swirl ominously. I felt an urge to turn back, but the others pushed forward. Finally, we reached a clearing, and the scene before us froze me in place. Several figures were silhouetted against a flickering light, standing in a circle. They wore tattered clothing and strange masks made of bark and leaves. Each held a lantern, illuminating their expressions, which were a mix of excitement and something darker. My stomach churned as I realized they were not just hikers, but a strange, almost cult-like gathering. Before we could process what we were witnessing, one of the figures spotted us. A loud, eerie laughter erupted from the group, sending chills down my spine. Panic set in, and we turned to run, but the path behind us felt altered, the trees closing in as if they were shifting, trapping us. We stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find our way back to camp. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the laughter that chased us. Just when I thought we were lost forever, we burst through the trees and back into our campsite, breathing heavily, but the camp wasn't how we left it. The fire pit was extinguished, the tents were torn, and our backpacks were scattered. In the center of the campsite was a single lantern, lit and flickering. Scrawled in the dirt around it were the words, "We've been waiting." Fear washed over us as we scrambled to gather our things. I glanced back toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figures watching us. We didn't speak as we packed, but the silence was thick with dread. We drove off in a rush, the night closing in around us. As we hit the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind us. Instead, I saw one of those figures standing at the edge of the woods, holding its lantern high, its face obscured by a mask. The last thing I remember is the figure raising a hand and pointing at me. And then we were gone. To this day, I avoid the woods, and I can never shake the feeling that they are waiting for me to return. When I was younger, I spent many weekends camping with friends in the woods. This one particular trip was planned to celebrate the end of summer. Just before school started, it was me, my cousin Emily, and our two friends, Jake and Sarah. We set up camp in a remote area, far from the busy trails and the noise of the city. The trees were tall and the air smelled of pine, a crispness that reminded us of adventure. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories as dusk turned to night. Sarah had brought her guitar, and we strummed out tunes under a star-filled sky. As the night deepened, I felt a strange energy in the air, almost electric, but I shrugged it off as excitement. As the fire crackled, Emily suggested a night hike. The woods were dark and inviting, and fueled by our earlier stories, we decided to go for it. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way into the forest. The moment we stepped off the clearing, the sounds of the night enveloped us. The chirping of crickets was punctuated by the rustle of leaves, a haunting symphony that was both thrilling and unnerving. We walked for what felt like an hour, chatting and laughing, when suddenly a loud rustling came from the bushes nearby. It sounded almost like a growl. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us wondering if we should turn back. Jake, always the brave one, insisted it was probably just a deer. So, we pressed on. As we moved deeper into the woods, We noticed something odd. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking the moonlight and casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond our line of sight. Then came the sound again. This time it was closer and more pronounced, a scraping noise like nails against wood. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed us forward. Just then, we stumbled into a small clearing, illuminated by our flashlights. There, we found an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. It looked abandoned, yet there was a strange feeling that we weren't alone. Despite the unease creeping over us, we approached the cabin, driven by adrenaline and the need for exploration. As we neared the door, I noticed something glimmering in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it and gasped. It was a small, rusty key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of its history. My friends gathered around, intrigued. We decided to look inside, the thrill of discovery overshadowing our instincts to leave. With some effort, we pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. As we explored, Sarah suddenly screamed, pointing to the wall. There were strange symbols carved into the wood. Some looked like faces, others like claws reaching out. We stepped back, our hearts racing. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, panic surging as we rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and a feeling of dread settled in our stomachs. Then, we heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Jake pushed against the door with all his might, and just as it started to budge, the footsteps stopped. We held our breath, the silence almost deafening. We decided to stay quiet, hoping whatever was out there would leave us alone. But then came a low whisper, so soft we could barely hear it. It was unintelligible, but laced with malice, sending chills down my spine. The door rattled as something pressed against it from the outside. Emily, shaking with fear, urged us to find a window. We all scrambled to the nearest one, fumbling with the broken glass, desperate to escape. But before we could get it open, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging us to listen. Suddenly, the key I had found began to glow in my hand. I glanced at my friends, confusion etched on their faces. Without thinking, I ran back to the door, inserting the key into the lock. To my shock, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open as if inviting us to flee. We stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the sounds of whispers fading behind us. We ran back to our camp, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. When we finally reached the safety of the fire, we collapsed in a heap, shaking with adrenaline and fear. But the night was not over. As we settled down, I noticed the key still clutched in my hand. My stomach dropped as I realized the symbols I had seen in the cabin were now etched into my skin, forming a pattern on my wrist that burned like a brand. We were never meant to leave that cabin, and I could feel something watching us from the darkness, waiting for its time. Camping has always been my favorite way to unwind. So, when a few friends and I decided to spend a weekend in the woods, I was thrilled. We found a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from the noise of civilization, and set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. The evening air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of crackling leaves beneath our feet. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories that made us all shiver. As the stories got darker, a chill settled over the group. My friend Mia suggested we take a walk through the woods to embrace the eerie atmosphere. She grinned mischievously, claiming it would be fun to get scared together. I felt a surge of apprehension, but also excitement. So, we decided to go. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and our own laughter echoing between the trees. As we walked deeper into the woods, we started to hear something unusual. It was faint at first, a low clanking sound, like chains dragging across the ground. We paused, exchanging nervous glances, but brushed it off as part of the forest symphony. Then we saw the tiny lights flickering in the distance. At first, they looked like fireflies, but as we approached, the lights grew larger and more distinct. Panic set in as the clanking grew louder, and it felt like the air around us thickened with unease. We decided to hide behind a cluster of bushes, hearts racing and breathless. Peering through the leaves, we saw figures emerging from the trees, each holding a lantern. They were dressed in tattered clothing, their faces obscured by dark hoods. The chains wrapped around their bodies rattled as they moved, creating an unsettling rhythm that sent shivers down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? The figures marched slowly past our hiding spot, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced eerily on the trees. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I thought I might burst from the tension, one of the figures turned its head toward us. The hood shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of pale skin beneath the darkness. My body tensed, and I could hardly suppress a gasp. But instead of approaching us, they continued on their path, vanishing deeper into the woods. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, terrified to move. When we finally mustered the courage to leave our hiding spot, we quickly made our way back to the campsite, the panic still coursing through our veins. The fire was still crackling, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We gathered around the fire, whispering about what we had seen, trying to convince ourselves it was all just a trick of the mind. The night wore on, but none of us could sleep. Every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs made us jump. Finally, as dawn approached, we decided to pack up and leave. We wanted to get out of the woods as quickly as possible. As we gathered our things, we noticed something strange. The area around the fire pit was disturbed, as if something had been dragged through the dirt. My stomach sank as I knelt to examine it. Embedded in the ground were large footprints leading away from our camp, deep and unmistakable. Then, I spotted something glinting near the edge of the firelight. I reached down and pulled out a small, rusted key. Confusion washed over me. What was it doing there? As I turned it over in my hand, the light caught an engraving on the side, the same twisted symbol that had adorned the lanterns of those figures we saw in the woods. Suddenly, a loud crack sounded behind us. We whipped around to see a tree branch falling to the ground, and at that moment, we all felt a cold breeze that seemed to whisper through the trees. We didn't waste another second. With our hearts pounding, we raced to the car, adrenaline fueling our escape. I glanced back one last time at the woods, an unsettling feeling settling deep in my gut. What had we stumbled upon? We drove away, vowing never to return, but the key remained with me. I still wonder who those figures were and what they wanted. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, a reminder that some secrets of the woods are best left undiscovered. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of our lives and reconnect with nature. My friends and I set out to a remote spot deep in the woods, eager to bask in the tranquility of the great outdoors. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. As darkness enveloped us, we huddled around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The warmth of the fire felt comforting against the chill that settled in. As the evening progressed, Yana, always the adventurous one, suggested a night hike. She teased that it would be scary, and her excitement was contagious. The others hesitated, but eventually, we all agreed. Fueled by the thrill of the unknown, with flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The forest was alive with sounds: the rustle of leaves, the call of distant owls, but it also felt eerily quiet, as if nature was holding its breath. We laughed and joked, but an undercurrent of unease settled among us as the darkness thickened. Suddenly, a chilling sound pierced the night. It was a faint clanking, like chains dragging along the forest floor. My heart raced as the noise grew louder, echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, the laughter dying on our lips. Then we saw tiny pinpricks of light glowing in the distance, slowly moving toward us. Panic surged through me. We ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes, barely daring to breathe. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as we strained to see what was approaching. The lights drew closer, illuminating the figures moving in the darkness. They were shrouded in white, their faces obscured by masks that gleamed in the dim light. Each figure held a lantern, their bodies wrapped in chains that rattled with every step. The group moved in unison, their steps deliberate, almost as if they were searching for something or someone. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I glanced at my friends, their faces pale with fear. We stayed hidden, our hearts pounding in our chests, as the figures passed just feet from our hiding spot. The clanking of chains mixed with the soft whispering of their voices, unintelligible but laced with a sense of urgency. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of our presence, that they were hunting for us. After what felt like an eternity, the figures moved on, disappearing into the darkness. We waited in silence, our minds racing with questions. Who were they? What did they want? As dawn approached, we finally emerged from our hiding place. Shaking with fear and disbelief, we made our way back to camp, still in shock from what we had witnessed. As the sun rose, illuminating our campsite, we felt a wave of relief wash over us. But that relief quickly turned to dread as we approached the fire pit. Our gear was scattered, the tents torn, and the fire, which we had put out before our hike, was blazing brightly. In the dirt beside the fire, words were scrawled hastily. You shouldn't have come. Panic surged through us again as we realized someone had been here. Someone had vandalized our camp while we were gone. I turned to my friends, their faces pale, and we all felt the same unspoken thought. We needed to get out of there. We quickly packed up what we could salvage, our hearts racing as we kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting those masked figures to emerge from the trees. As we stumbled back to our car, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we finally drove away, the forest faded into the background, but the sense of dread lingered. I thought about how quickly our adventure had turned into a nightmare. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that I dared to glance at the rearview mirror. I froze. Standing in the road, illuminated by the morning light, was a figure in white, the same mask gleaming in the sun, a lantern swinging at their side. I gasped, and my friends turned to look, but by the time we turned around, the road was empty. We never spoke of that night again, but every year, when fall approached, I felt that familiar chill creep back in, reminding me that the woods were not as empty as they seemed, and that some secrets are best left undiscovered. The sun dipped below the horizon as I set up camp with my friends in a secluded area deep in the woods. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, eager to escape our busy lives for a weekend of hiking and storytelling around the campfire. My friends, Mia, Jake, and Sam, arrived as twilight settled in. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. As darkness fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Laughter echoed through the trees, drowning out the sounds of the wilderness. But, as the firelight flickered, shadows danced along the edges of our clearing, creating an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I brushed it off, attributing my nerves to the stories we were telling. After a while, Mia suggested we explore a nearby trail that wound deeper into the woods. She joked that it would be spooky, which made Jake laugh. Ignoring the gnawing feeling in my stomach, I agreed. After all, we were here for adventure. Armed with flashlights, we set off into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the thickening night. The deeper we walked, the quieter the forest became. I could feel the tension in the air, and soon, even the crickets fell silent. A strange unease settled over us. I caught Jake glancing nervously into the trees, and Sam kept turning around as if expecting something to follow us. Just when I thought about suggesting we head back, a sudden clatter broke the stillness, a loud crash that echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. What was that? Mia whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before I could respond, we heard another noise like chains rattling, echoing from somewhere up ahead. We froze, our flashlights illuminating only a small radius of the oppressive darkness. I felt my heart race, pounding in my ears. We exchanged anxious glances, each of us too afraid to speak. Then, I noticed a faint light glowing through the trees ahead, flickering like lanterns. Curiosity mixed with fear compelled us to move closer. As we crept through the underbrush, the sounds grew louder. The clanking of chains and the flickering light became increasingly unnerving. Finally, we reached a clearing, and what we saw will haunt me forever. A group of figures stood in a circle, their backs turned toward us. Each wore tattered clothing and held a lantern that swung slowly in the night. The light illuminated their faces pale and obscured by dirt and grime. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed they were bound in chains, shackled at the wrists and ankles. They swayed slightly, as if caught in a trance, their movements synchronized in an unsettling rhythm. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. I looked at my friends, their faces reflecting my horror. The group seemed oblivious to our presence, lost in whatever ritual they were performing. I felt a primal urge to run, but I was frozen in place, captivated by the macabre scene unfolding before us. Just as I began to step back, one of the figures turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. The mask covering its face was crude, painted with dark streaks that looked like tears. I felt a chill wash over me, and instinct kicked in. We turned to flee, sprinting back the way we came, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The sounds of clanking chains followed us, echoing through the trees. We burst into our campsite, panting and terrified. The fire had died down to embers, casting ghostly shadows around us. We gathered our things, adrenaline still pumping through our bodies. The chilling memory of what we had seen was etched in my mind. But, as we packed in a frenzy, I spotted something on the ground near the fire pit. I knelt down and touched it. It was a rusted chain link, heavy and cold. My heart sank, panic surged through us, and we raced to the car, hearts pounding, desperate to leave the suffocating forest behind. As we drove away, the trees began to blur, the darkness swallowing us whole. I thought we were safe until a flicker of light caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There, in the shadows of the woods, I saw the figures standing still, holding their lanterns, watching us leave. Their haunting presence lingered in the night, a reminder that whatever we had encountered would forever remain in the depths of those woods. Camping had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. When my friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote site deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and drove until the city lights vanished behind us. The excitement buzzed in the air as we set up camp, and I felt an undeniable thrill at the prospect of sleeping under the stars. As night fell, the forest transformed, shadows deepened, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. But, as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, my friend Jenna suggested we explore the woods a bit further. Feeling adventurous and slightly emboldened by the warmth of the fire, we agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick air. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and every rustle made my heart race. As we walked deeper into the woods, a cold wind swept through the trees, chilling me to the bone. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it, a low, guttural sound. My stomach twisted into knots, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Jenna, ever the jokester, laughed it off and urged us to keep going. Despite my instinct screaming to turn back, I followed, curiosity overriding my fear. Then we saw it. A flickering light in the distance, just beyond a thicket of trees. It glowed like a beacon, and we instinctively moved toward it. As we approached, I felt a rising sense of dread. The light danced erratically, illuminating something that looked like figures standing in a clearing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the sound of chains clanking filled the air, growing louder and closer. Panic surged through me, and we all froze. What were those figures? Were they real? Jenna whispered that we should hide, and we quickly ducked behind a large tree, our hearts pounding. Peering around the trunk, we saw the figures more clearly. They were cloaked in ragged white fabric, their faces obscured by masks that were painted to resemble anguished expressions. Each figure held a lantern, and the light glinted off the chains wrapped around their bodies. They moved slowly, almost like they were searching for something. The clinking of their chains echoed ominously through the stillness of the night. My pulse raced as fear gripped me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Just then, one of the figures turned, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The mask hid its face, but I felt a chill run down my spine, as if it were staring directly into my soul. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by terror. The figures began to move again, continuing their slow march through the woods. As they faded into the distance, I finally found my voice. "We should get back to camp," I urged, my heart pounding in my ears. The others nodded, their faces pale, and we turned to make our way back. We stumbled through the darkness, adrenaline fueling our every step. As we broke through the trees and reached our campsite, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. Our camp was in disarray. The tents were torn, and the fire had been doused. Panic gripped us again. What happened here? Jenna screamed when she spotted something on the ground. We rushed over, and my stomach dropped. There, scratched into the earth, were the words, "We will find you." The message was clear and chilling. We gathered what we could and raced to the car, each of us glancing over our shoulders as if expecting to see those figures emerge from the shadows. As we sped away, the forest receding behind us. I thought about the figures. They had looked so surreal, so dreamlike, yet the fear they inspired felt painfully real. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw one of the masked figures standing at the edge of the trees, lantern glowing softly in the darkness, watching us leave. That image haunts me still, a terrifying reminder that some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. I never spoke of that night to anyone, afraid they might think I was losing my grip on reality. Sometimes, when I find myself alone at night, the memory of those chains clanking sends a chill through my bones, and I wonder if they ever really let us go. The summer sun dipped low as we arrived at the campsite, a remote stretch of forest far from the buzz of civilization. I had always found solace in the woods, but something felt different this time. It was just me, Jenna, and Marcus' friends who were eager for a weekend of adventure, away from the constant hum of daily life. We set up our tents as the air cooled, and laughter filled the clearing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. As darkness enveloped the forest, Jenna suggested we take a night hike. The idea sparked excitement, but I felt a twinge of hesitation. Still, the thrill of exploring the woods at night won out, and soon we were wandering deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were boarded up. Intrigued, we approached cautiously. Marcus, ever the brave one, nudged the door, and to our surprise, it creaked open. A wave of unease washed over me, but my curiosity urged me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded photographs on the wall, images of families smiling, their eyes hauntingly empty. A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I stayed, captivated by the strange energy that enveloped the cabin. We explored for a while, but as the shadows grew longer, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep in the woods. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. It wasn't an animal, it was something else. Something menacing. We hurried back to the campsite, the fire crackling warmly as we huddled close. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Marcus, silently acknowledging the unease that hung in the air. As the night wore on, I found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. I suggested we play a game to distract ourselves. We ended up telling ghost stories, our voices hushed as the tales grew darker. At one point, Marcus shared a legend he'd heard about a creature that roamed these woods, a spirit that took the form of a lost traveler, luring people into the forest never to return. Just as he finished, a loud crash echoed from the woods. My heart raced as we all jumped, flashlights flickering nervously in the direction of the sound. We strained to see, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged, illuminated briefly by our lights. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an unsettling intensity. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, they're coming for me." We were frozen, the air thick with tension. I looked at Jenna and Marcus, both pale and wide-eyed. The man took a step closer, and in that moment, something shifted in the shadows behind him. More figures appeared, all with the same hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They emerged like wraiths from the darkness, their bodies flickering in and out of the light. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, we scrambled for the safety of the trees, hearts pounding in our chests. We ducked behind a large oak, breathless and terrified, as the figures advanced. their murmurs echoing through the night. I could feel the weight of their gaze, chilling and predatory. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a voice whispering my name from the depths of the woods. It sounded just like Jenna. My stomach dropped. The growls returned, closer now, mingling with the whispers. Realizing we were being lured into the forest, I grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go," I shouted. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape, not stopping until we burst into the clearing where our campfire flickered in the darkness. We made it back to the tents, shaking and terrified, convinced we'd escaped whatever haunted those woods. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings in silence, the shadows of the night still looming large in our minds. Just before we left, I glanced back at the cabin. Its presence felt like a dark secret. There was a flash of movement in one of the windows, a face peering out, grinning wide. I blinked, and it was gone. We jumped into the car and drove away, vowing never to return, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. Little did we know, we weren't the first to escape those woods, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries. They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. Most nights are quiet, but there was one night that has haunted me ever since. It was mid-October, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. I was on a routine patrol when the eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Around 8 p.m., I got a call over the radio. A family camping nearby reported strange noises coming from the woods. The father described them as high-pitched screeches followed by low growls. Unlike anything they had ever heard, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I told them I would check it out, trying to keep my voice steady. As I hiked toward their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, but there was something else, a low thudding sound echoing in the distance. It felt unnatural, rhythmic, almost as if something was moving through the trees. When I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet. The family's tent stood dark and still, the flickering light of their campfire casting long shadows on the ground. I called out to them, but received no reply. A knot formed in my stomach as I unzipped the tent. Inside, their belongings were scattered, but the family was gone. Their sleeping bags lay untouched, and I noticed a half-eaten bag of marshmallows abandoned by the fire. Then I heard it again, the thudding sound, now closer and more urgent. Panic surged through me. I stepped out of the tent, gripping my flashlight tightly. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive. I swept the light around, searching for any sign of the family. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, its shape distorted and unnatural. It looked humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head oddly shaped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature turned its head toward me, revealing eyes that glowed like embers. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. The creature let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the thudding sound behind me, getting closer with each step. The adrenaline surged through me as I pushed myself harder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst onto the main trail where I had parked my truck. I fumbled for the radio, breathless as I called for backup. I needed help. I needed to find that family. After what felt like an eternity, another ranger arrived. A flashlight in hand, we retraced my steps back to the campsite, but the creature was gone. I explained everything to my fellow ranger, and we searched the area thoroughly. The family was still missing. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something unusual. A set of footprints leading away from the campsite, deep imprints in the soft ground that looked far too large to belong to any human. I followed the prints, my heart racing again. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above us. After several minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, with its trunk gnarled and twisted, and at the base of that tree lay the family's belongings: hiking boots, a backpack, and even a stuffed animal. But there was no sign of them. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a soft whimper. I turned to see the ranger beside me, his face pale and ashen. Then it happened. The ground beneath us shifted, and the massive tree creaked ominously. I stumbled back as I realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a trap, a living thing. The roots twisted and curled, reaching out like fingers, searching for more. Suddenly, the tree shuddered violently, and I was knocked to the ground. The ranger shouted, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, never looking back. The next morning, the search teams found the family unharmed, wandering near the edge of the woods, unaware of what had transpired. They insisted they had only gone for a short walk and had become disoriented in the darkness. The ranger and I tried to explain, but no one believed us. They had returned unscathed, but I knew what lurked beneath the surface of those woods. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods, but one October evening still stands out in my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I was assigned the late shift, my radio crackling softly as I moved through the trails, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It was a typical night until I received a call from a couple camping in a secluded area about 10 miles into the woods. They reported hearing strange noises, a mix of growls and whispers that sent shivers down their spines. I tried to calm them, assuring them it was likely just a nearby animal, but their fear was palpable. I told them I would head their way and check things out. The hike to their campsite was uneventful at first, the familiar sounds of the forest filling my ears. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds faded, and an unnatural silence enveloped me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping to coax it back to life. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the couple's campsite, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Their tent stood in disarray, the zipper partially open, and belongings scattered around as if a storm had swept through. But the couple was nowhere to be found. I called out their names, but only silence answered. My instincts kicked in, and I moved cautiously, scanning the area. As I walked further into the woods, I stumbled upon a trail of what looked like deep claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. My heart raced as I followed the marks, trying to piece together what had happened. Each claw mark seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, beckoning me forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to find the couple or at least something that would explain their disappearance. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced as I followed the movement, adrenaline surging through me. I stumbled upon a small clearing where I saw a figure standing with its back to me. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step closer. Just as I was about to reach out, the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back in shock, and the figure opened its mouth to let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to flee, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted back the way I came. Behind me, the figure's scream echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that filled the air. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping branches as it pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I finally burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the couple's tent still stood. Panting, I skidded to a stop, turning to face the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The growling returned, echoing through the trees, and I, prepared for whatever might come. Just then, the couple emerged from the woods, their faces pale with fear. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, and I couldn't help but feel relief wash over me. They told me they had wandered off looking for firewood and had gotten lost, but as I looked back into the forest, I noticed something chilling. The figure I had seen was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us with those same hollow eyes. I grabbed the couple and we hiked back to the ranger station, glancing over our shoulders, convinced that whatever had followed us was still lurking in the shadows. We made it safely back, but as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something dark escape the woods that night, a presence that was no longer confined to the deep trees. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. I had always loved the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days exploring trails and checking on campers. That summer had been particularly quiet. Most families had left for the season, and I found myself patrolling areas that were usually bustling with life. The trees stood like silent sentinels, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. One late afternoon, I received a call on the radio from a family camping deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. At first, I brushed it off as wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the father's voice trembled with fear as he described the sounds. It was terrific, he insisted, not like anything they had heard before. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my gear and made my way to their campsite, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. As I walked, the familiar path became less inviting, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I reached the campsite as darkness fell, and the only light came from the flickering glow of their campfire. The family, a mother, father, and 2 children, sat huddled together, their faces pale. They explained that the noises had started as low growls, but soon morphed into something more unsettling and eerie chanting that seemed to echo through the trees. I scanned the area, feeling the weight of their fear settling in my chest. The father pointed toward the woods, his finger trembling. It was then that I heard a distant, rhythmic sound that pierced through the silence. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The chant was muffled, yet it resonated with an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill wind swirl around us, sending leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. I told the family to stay by the fire, and I stepped away, shining my flashlight into the darkened woods. The beam danced nervously over the trees, illuminating nothing but the bark and shadows. The chanting seemed to grow louder, creeping closer. I retraced my steps back to the family, but just as I turned, I noticed something moving in the darkness. A tall figure slipped between the trees, its form almost blending into the night. I swallowed hard, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for rangers to feel unnerved at night, but I felt compelled to investigate. I told the family to stay put and quietly approached the edge of the forest. The chanting stopped, replaced by unsettling silence that pressed down on me like a weight. As I stepped deeper into the trees, the atmosphere shifted. The air turned cold, and the familiar sounds of the woods faded away. I could hear only my heartbeat echoing in my ears, pounding louder as I ventured further into the unknown. I trained my flashlight on the path ahead, but the beam flickered ominously, threatening to go out completely. Suddenly, the chanting erupted again, louder and more urgent. I could feel it reverberate through my bones. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the trees themselves were alive and whispering secrets. Panic surged within me, but I pushed forward, determined to uncover the source. Then I saw a circle of strange symbols etched into the ground, surrounded by twisted branches that formed a crude barrier. The figure I had seen earlier stood at the center, but it was not human. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that reflected my flashlight like mirrors. My breath caught in my throat as it turned toward me, its face a void, a black pit that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the family was just behind me, having followed out of concern. I turned to them, shouting for them to run, but before I could react, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, expecting the worst, but instead, the ground erupted in a flash of light. The symbols glowed bright, illuminating the woods for a brief moment, before plunging everything back into darkness. The creature vanished, leaving only a lingering echo of its chant behind. The family looked at me, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. I led them back to the campsite, my heart still pounding. The strange occurrences continued through the night, but we remained together, the family's presence grounding me. In the morning, we reported everything to the authorities, but when the search teams returned to the site, they found nothing, no symbols, no signs of the creature. The family and I were left with our memories, the knowledge of what we had experienced buried within us. As the family packed up to leave, I realized something chilling. The chanting had stopped, but the echo of those glowing eyes lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the woods hold secrets best left undiscovered. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of four: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yena suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray, tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale, but the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and pack my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. I have always loved the solitude of the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days monitoring trails, maintaining campsites, and ensuring that everyone enjoyed their time in nature safely. One chilly autumn evening, I was assigned the last shift of the season, just as the leaves were starting to fall and the air turned crisp. Little did I know that this night would change my perspective on the forest forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set out on my usual patrol. The trees towered over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, a sound that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt ominous. I had always been aware of the stories the locals spoke of strange happenings in these woods, whispers of creatures lurking just beyond the trees. I never paid them much mind, chalking it up to urban legends meant to scare children. About an hour into my shift, I noticed something unusual. Off the main trail, a flickering light danced through the trees. My curiosity piqued. I cautiously approached, thinking it might be a group of campers in need of help. As I got closer, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. As I turned back to the path, I heard a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I glanced over my shoulder, but the forest was still. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks. However, the feeling of being watched pressed heavily on my chest. I continued my patrol, but the unease lingered. As I approached the campsite where a family was staying, I noticed their tent was zipped shut, and the campfire was still burning, casting flickering shadows. I called out to them, but there was no response. I stepped closer, peering inside the tent, and saw it empty, with no sign of the family. My heart raced. Where could they have gone? Just then, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a chilling scream. The sound came from deeper in the woods, sending my adrenaline into overdrive. I sprinted towards the source, fear gripping my heart. Each step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. Waiting. As I reached a small clearing, I stumbled upon something terrifying. The ground was torn up, as if a massive animal had been digging frantically. The scream had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my beam cutting through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and the scattered remnants of what looked like a picnic, broken plates, an overturned cooler. Then I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My heart raced as I called out again, this time louder. The shadow paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. It vanished before I could process what I had seen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned to flee back towards the trail. In my panic, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard a low growl emanating from the darkness. It sounded closer now. My instincts kicked in, and I ran, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I had to get back to my truck, back to safety. Finally, I burst out onto the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back, scanning the shadows. Nothing followed. I reached my truck, fumbling for the keys as the growl echoed in my mind. Just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The family I had thought was missing stood just outside the tree line. They appeared disheveled, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. I leapt out, relieved they were safe. As I approached, I noticed something behind them. The twisted figure I had seen earlier was standing silently, its grotesque form illuminated by the headlights of my truck. But instead of lunging at us, it simply stood there, watching. The family had been lost, but had found their way back when they heard the scream, which was not their own, but rather a warning to escape. The creature, whatever it was, had been trying to protect them from something far worse lurking deeper in the woods. We stood together in shock, realizing that sometimes the real monsters are the unseen forces that drive fear into our hearts. With the morning light creeping in, we hurried out of the woods, grateful to have survived the night, but forever haunted by what we had encountered in the shadows. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place, I watched as they danced around the fire. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. I have always loved the deep woods, the way the tall trees whisper secrets as the wind moves through them. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these woods and the visitors who came to enjoy them. It was mid-October when I received a call about a group of campers who hadn't checked in. I grabbed my gear and set out into the forest, ready to find them. The sun had set by the time I reached their designated campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tents were still pitched, but the area was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no sounds of wrestling gear. I called out, hoping for a response, but silence met me. I stepped inside the nearest tent. Their sleeping bags were untouched, and the gear was scattered but still there. My heart raced as I realized something was wrong. I scanned the area, looking for signs of a struggle, but found nothing except a small trail leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The air grew heavier, the sounds of the forest fading into an eerie stillness. As I walked, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see a fellow ranger or the campers behind me, but I was alone. I pressed on, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. I heard a snap of a twig behind me and spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trail led me to a small clearing where the moonlight spilled onto the ground, illuminating what looked like a campsite. There was a fire pit, but it hadn't been used in a long time. I approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of life. That's when I saw a shape in the shadows near the tree line. I squinted, trying to make it out, and my heart stopped. It looked like a person, but something was off. The figure was hunched over, and as I stepped closer, I could see it was covered in dirt and leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I called out, trying to sound brave. "Hello. Are you okay?" The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by hair and grime. It opened its mouth to speak, but what came out was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure lunged forward, and I turned to run, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sprinted back toward the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran. Branches whipped at my face, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could hear the figure crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. I had to reach the other rangers at the visitor center. They would know what to do. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor. I rolled over just in time to see the figure looming above me, its breath heavy and ragged. In a moment of sheer desperation, I reached for my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light caught its face, and I felt a jolt of horror as I recognized it. It was one of the campers, but not as I remembered. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was caked in mud and leaves. I stumbled back, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Where are the others?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The camper's expression shifted, a look of terror on his face. He pointed behind me, and as I turned, I froze. The rest of the campers stood at the edge of the clearing, but they were not alone. A group of twisted figures circled them, their bodies unnaturally contorted, faces hidden beneath matted hair. As the figures moved closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees, but it wasn't the joyous laughter of campers. It was taunting, sinister. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the truth. The campers were playing a game, a sick, twisted game in the dark, luring me in. The laughter crescendoed, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. But as I stood there, I remembered my training. I was a park ranger, not a victim. I turned and ran, this time not looking back. I burst through the tree line and onto the main path, gasping for air. I kept running until I reached the visitor center, where I collapsed against the door, heart pounding. I told my fellow rangers everything, but they only stared at me, confusion in their eyes. I knew what I saw, but when we returned to the campsite, there was nothing. No campers, no signs of struggle, just an empty campsite in the moonlight. It was as if they had never existed at all. To this day, I still patrol those woods, and when the wind whispers through the trees, I hear their laughter echoing in the night. I know they are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to join their game. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, the laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. As a park ranger, I had seen my share of odd things in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for the night of the storm. It was late October, and the trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving the forest eerily bare. The air felt thick with anticipation as I patrolled the campground, the wind rustling the branches overhead like whispers of a forgotten language. I had just finished my usual rounds when the first raindrops began to fall. I headed back to my truck, ready to ride out the storm. That's when I received the radio call. A family had set up camp in a remote area, and they reported strange noises coming from the woods. Their kids were terrified, and the father asked for someone to check it out. I hesitated. I knew that area was notoriously isolated. Still, I felt a duty to help. With the rain now pouring, I drove as far as I could on the muddy trail, parking a good half-mile from their campsite. The light from my flashlight flickered in the dark, illuminated only by the occasional crack of lightning. I felt an unsettling chill as I walked toward their tent, the wet ground squelching beneath my boots. The sound of rain drowned out the forest sounds, creating an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Upon reaching the campsite, I called out to them. No answer. I peered into the tent, half expecting to see the family huddled inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags were neatly arranged, their backpacks untouched. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, scanning the area, when I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the nearby thicket. Adrenaline surged through me, but I couldn't abandon my duty. I called out again, asking if anyone was there. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Just as I turned to leave, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and slender, stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't look human. The figure stepped closer, and my heart raced as I tried to make out its features. It was all wrong. Tall, limbs elongated, and its skin glistened like wet bark. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I knew I couldn't leave without confirming the family's safety. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and shone my flashlight in its direction. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing not one figure, but several shadows shifting just beyond the trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. I felt a rush of panic as I realized they were closing in on me, the growling growing louder. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a chilling mix of anger and desperation. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I darted through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I could hear them behind me, their movements swift and unnatural, and I pushed myself to go faster, fueled by sheer terror. As I burst back onto the main trail, the growling ceased. I stopped, panting heavily, glancing back into the woods. The darkness loomed silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to call for help, I caught sight of a flicker of movement in the trees. It was then that I saw them. The family I had come to find was standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at me with wide eyes. They were unharmed, but their faces were pale, their expressions frozen in fear. I rushed over, relief flooding my chest. I asked what had happened. The father shook his head, his voice trembling. They had been hearing strange noises all night, but when they stepped out of the tent to investigate, they saw something in the shadows watching them. They didn't know what it was, but it terrified them into staying inside. As we gathered around my truck, the father suddenly pointed behind me. I turned slowly, dread washing over me. Just beyond the trees stood the figure again, but this time it was smiling, a twisted grin splitting its face. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. It had been playing with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that instant, the lights on my truck flickered, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck. The family clutched each other, and I could feel my body tense as the air grew thick with malice. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had survived for now, but the woods were still alive with something sinister, and we were far from safe. I was no stranger to the deep woods, but that night felt different. The air was thick with humidity, and the trees stood tall and oppressive, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the moonlight. I had just finished my patrol when I received a radio call about a disturbance near a campsite. A family had reported strange noises outside their tent, and as I drove down the narrow dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Arriving at the site, I found the family huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide. They described the sounds they had heard: low growls, scratching against the tent, and the unnerving feeling of being watched. I reassured them, trying to downplay their fears. I told them it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. I set up my flashlight and began my inspection of the area, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife. The woods were silent except for the rustle of leaves. I stepped deeper into the shadows, scanning for any signs of disturbance. As I walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, as if I were not alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. The darkness felt alive, pulsating with an unseen energy. I pushed the feeling aside and pressed on. After a few minutes, I heard a faint sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like something hard striking wood. I followed the sound, moving cautiously toward a thicket of trees. The tapping grew louder, echoing off the trunks. When I reached the edge, I shined my flashlight into the brush and froze. A figure stood just beyond the trees, illuminated by my light. It was hunched over, its back to me. It looked like a person, but its movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural. My heart pounded as I called out. The figure slowly turned its head, and what I saw made me stagger back in shock. Its eyes were wide and hollow, the skin stretched taut over its bones, as if it had not eaten in days. It opened its mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In a panic, I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The creature lunged at me, and I scrambled to my feet, racing back toward the campsite. I burst into the clearing, panting and wild-eyed. The family saw my expression and immediately huddled closer, confusion and fear written all over their faces. I took a moment to catch my breath and told them what I had seen. As I spoke, I could hear the tapping sound again, this time closer. It was as if the creature had followed me. The family exchanged terrified glances, and I knew I had to protect them. I grabbed my radio and called for backup. My voice shaky. Just then, a sudden loud crash echoed through the woods. The tent shook, and the ground beneath us seemed to vibrate. The children screamed, and the father grabbed his wife, pulling her and the kids close. I felt my stomach drop as I realized the sound had come from the thicket where I had seen the creature. Before I could react, the tapping transformed into frantic scratching, like claws raking against wood. I shined my flashlight toward the noise, heart racing. In that moment, the creature burst from the trees, but it wasn't alone. A second creature followed, then a third. They were all identical, their grotesque forms illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. As they rushed toward us, something unexpected happened. The creatures halted suddenly, their heads tilting in unison, as if confused. I was terrified, but found myself intrigued. This was a momentary pause that felt oddly surreal. They were not advancing. They seemed to be assessing us, as if we were the strange ones. And then I understood. I had a flash of insight. They were not attacking. They were mimicking us, reflecting our fear. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders. I had to assert dominance. I yelled at the family to stay behind me and began to shout, making myself seem larger, more threatening. To my surprise, the creatures took a step back. One by one, they turned and retreated into the darkness, their movements becoming less jerky and more fluid as they disappeared. The air lightened as they vanished from view. The family and I stood frozen for a moment, the tension slowly easing. It dawned on us that the creatures had only been curious, drawn to our fear. We survived the encounter, and as dawn broke, I realized that sometimes, what we fear the most is simply a reflection of ourselves. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights alone in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for that Halloween weekend. The air was thick with an eerie silence as I patrolled the trails, the trees standing like dark sentinels under the moonlight. Most campers had left for the season, leaving only a handful of brave souls to brave the chill. I didn't mind. The quiet was almost comforting. That evening, I received a radio call from a family camping in the more isolated part of the park. They were having a Halloween-themed campfire and invited me to join. I was hesitant, but agreed, thinking it would be good to check on them. I set out, flashlight in hand, making my way through the winding trails. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, casting unsettling shadows that danced around me. As I approached their campsite, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The fire flickered weakly, illuminating the faces of the family to parents and their young daughter, all dressed in Halloween costumes. They greeted me warmly, inviting me to sit with them. The smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and laughter echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then, the girl, dressed as a ghost, pointed to the tree line. "Look, there's someone over there," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I turned to see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. The parents laughed it off, but my instincts kicked in. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or perhaps an animal. But as I settled in, unease settled in my stomach. The night wore on, and the girl continued to glance nervously toward the woods. She kept insisting there was someone watching us. The adults dismissed her claims, but I felt a prickle of fear. Just then, a loud rustle erupted from the bushes. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, its beam trembling. The parents jumped to their feet, trying to reassure their daughter. But as I stood, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the light in its direction. The figure was thin and gaunt, its face obscured by a mask, but I could see the glint of something metallic in its hand. The parents screamed, and the girl hid behind her father. "Stay back," I shouted, stepping forward. The figure didn't move, its presence unnaturally still. Just as fear began to take hold, the family bolted in the opposite direction, leaving me alone. My instincts kicked in, and I followed, shouting for them to stop. We ran through the dark forest, panic rising with every step. I could hear the figure following us, its footfalls light yet relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The path twisted and turned, and I began to lose my bearings. The woods felt alive, branches reaching out like claws as we hurried through the underbrush. Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating our frantic faces. The parents were panting, the little girl crying. Just then, the figure emerged behind us, and I instinctively stepped in front of the family. I was ready to confront whatever horror this was when, without warning, the figure reached up and pulled off its mask. To my disbelief, it was a fellow park ranger I worked with, wearing a goofy smile and holding a fake axe. "Surprise," he shouted. his voice echoing through the clearing. The family and I stood there, stunned. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by frustration. What the hell was that? I yelled. The ranger explained that he wanted to give the campers a Halloween scare, but clearly, he had taken it too far. The family was just as confused, their fear slowly turning to anger. The little girl, wiping her tears, asked, "Is that a real axe?" "No, sweetheart, it's just a prop," he said, chuckling. Just then, I noticed something behind him, a rustle in the bushes. My heart dropped as I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped a real figure, hunched and menacing, with a glint of silver reflecting in the light. The ranger's face drained of color, and I realized with horror that the prank had attracted something far more sinister. The family and I backed away, panic setting in again as the true danger revealed itself. This was no joke anymore. The ranger dropped his prop and we all turned to run, leaving the clearing behind, our previous fright replaced by sheer terror. The woods, once familiar and safe, now felt like a haunted labyrinth, every shadow a potential threat. In the end, we all survived, but I knew I would never see the woods the same way again. The night had started with a scare, but had turned into something real and terrifying. It reminded me that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are not just figments of our imagination, and the woods hold secrets that should remain undisturbed. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. My friends and I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, setting up our tents in a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We spent the early evening cooking over the fire, laughing and sharing stories, while the stars began to prick the darkening sky. As darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. My friend Lucas, always the jokester, suggested we play a game of truth or dare to spice things up. Amid laughter and playful taunts, Yena, my adventurous friend, dared us to take a night hike into the woods. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading into the shadows. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest came alive. The trees loomed around us, their branches creaking in the wind like ghostly whispers. As we walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We wandered for what felt like an eternity, our laughter fading as we noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. Just then, a sharp sound pierced the silence, a loud crack, like something heavy breaking through the branches. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the noise. In the distance, we saw a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing between the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Lucas squinted into the darkness, a grin creeping across his face. "Probably just some campers. Let's check it out." Despite my instincts telling me to turn back, curiosity got the better of us. We crept through the underbrush, the flickering light growing brighter as we approached. The air became thick with tension, each step feeling like a mistake. Then, out of nowhere, the lights vanished. "Where did it go?" Yena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we could answer, the sounds of chains rattling filled the air, sending chills down my spine. Panic washed over us, and we instinctively dove behind a thick bush. Heart pounding, we peered out to see what was happening. My mind raced as I fought to control my breathing. Then we saw them. Figures cloaked in dark, tattered clothing emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the darkness. Each figure was shackled, chains dragging behind them as they moved with a disturbing, slow grace. Lanterns hung from their hands, illuminating their path and casting haunting shadows on the trees. My stomach dropped as I realized we were not supposed to be here. My instincts screamed for us to run, but we were frozen in place, horror rendering us immobile. The figures shuffled closer, their chains clanking ominously, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had shrunk to just us and them. I felt Gina's grip tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to whisper something reassuring, but no words came. Instead, we watched, breathless, as the procession passed mere feet from our hiding place. I thought I saw one of them glance in our direction, but the lantern's light obscured their eyes. Once the figures moved on, we wasted no time scrambling back the way we came. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we raced through the underbrush, branches clawing at our clothes. We burst out of the trees, breathless and terrified, collapsing beside our campfire. But when we reached our campsite, we were met with a shocking sight. Our tents lay toppled, gear scattered across the ground. The fire was extinguished, its embers barely glowing. As we scrambled to gather our things, I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. "You should not have come." A wave of fear washed over us, and we grabbed our belongings in a frenzy, not bothering to gather everything. As we made our way to the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. There was no sign of the figures, but the air felt thick with their presence. We drove away, hearts pounding, vowing never to return. But, as we sped down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a flickering light. It faded quickly, but the sense of dread remained. What if those figures had followed us? What if they were still watching? The dark woods behind us seemed to breathe, hiding secrets I hoped never to uncover. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure. Tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs, it stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family, mom, dad, and two kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. I had always loved the solitude of the woods. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these natural wonders, but I also enjoyed the peace that came with the deep trees and endless trails. However, my perspective shifted during a chilling autumn night that I still can't shake. It was late October when the leaves transformed into brilliant reds and golds, drawing visitors to the park for one last glimpse before winter. I was scheduled for a night shift, checking the campsites and ensuring everyone was safe. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my rounds. The campgrounds were mostly empty. The few campers that remained were huddled around their fires, sharing ghost stories. I smiled at their laughter, but it faded quickly as I walked deeper into the woods. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and a sense of unease began creeping in. About an hour into my shift, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unnerving, almost deliberate. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but only darkness greeted me. I hesitated, but the sound stopped, and I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal. I continued my patrol, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When I reached the farthest campsite, I noticed a flickering light. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be an unattended fire. Instead, I found a tent with the flap wide open and no one around. Inside, there were scattered belongings and a half-eaten sandwich lying on the ground, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in. Something felt very wrong. I called out for the campers, but there was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I decided to check the nearby trails, but as I walked away from the campsite, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It sent chills down my spine, but I pressed on, trying to rationalize it as my imagination. The forest seemed to darken as the wind picked up, carrying a sudden coldness that wrapped around me. I hurried back to the campsite, but the tent was still empty. Panic began to set in as I fumbled for my radio to call for backup, but the device crackled with static. I was alone. I decided to head back to the main road, thinking I could catch a passing ranger or even a hiker. But the deeper I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out any trace of moonlight, and I realized I had lost my way. The growl returned, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced as I turned to run, but then I saw a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like cold embers in the dark. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My instincts kicked in, and I took off in the opposite direction, adrenaline coursing through me. As I ran, branches snagged at my clothes, and the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. The growling intensified behind me, chasing me through the maze of trees. Just when I thought I was safe, I tripped over a root and fell. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back. The figure had stopped, but I could feel its gaze boring into my back. Desperate, I sprinted toward a clearing, praying it would lead me to safety. Bursting into the open, I spotted the campers I had seen earlier. They were standing by their fire, but something was off. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking. They stared past me into the darkness of the woods. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. I turned to see the figure emerge from the trees, and the campers began to scream. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized the campers weren't frozen in fear. They were entranced, caught in some horrifying spell. In that moment, the figure lunged at them, but just before it could reach them, it vanished into thin air. The campers blinked and suddenly returned to normal, confusion etched on their faces. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I had lost my mind, but the figure was gone, leaving only an echo of its growl behind. The campers recounted their own experiences of feeling watched, of shadows moving just out of sight. We all made it back to the ranger station that night, shaken but alive, leaving the mystery of the woods behind us. Yet sometimes, as I patrol the park, I catch glimpses of glowing eyes watching from the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. I thought I had chosen the perfect spot for our weekend camping trip, deep in the woods where we could escape the city and embrace nature. My friends and I, excited and eager, set up camp as dusk fell. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sounds of wildlife. It felt magical, a perfect escape from our mundane lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Laughter echoed through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as the stars began to twinkle above, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest felt alive, and not just with the usual sounds of nature. Something else lingered in the air, a palpable tension that made my skin prickle. Jenna, my adventurous friend, suggested a night hike. She had a knack for dragging us into questionable situations, and tonight was no different. Fueled by curiosity and the lingering adrenaline from the campfire, we agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light flickering over twisted branches and the underbrush. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but Jenna kept pushing forward, excited by the thrill of the unknown. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a series of frantic wrestlings. My heart raced as we turned to face the direction of the noise. Fear clawed at my throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dim light of our flashlights. It was a man, covered in dirt and leaves, his eyes wild and desperate. He stumbled toward us, breathing heavily, chains dragging behind him. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out. Panic surged within me, and I grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her back. We stumbled over each other as we ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We ducked into a thicket of bushes, hearts pounding, praying we were hidden. From our hiding spot, we watched as the man continued to pace, his chains rattling. Then we noticed the lights. Tiny, flickering lanterns began to dot the forest floor, slowly illuminating a group of figures approaching from the shadows. They moved with an unnatural grace, their faces obscured by masks, their bodies swathed in tattered cloth. Each one held a lantern, casting an eerie glow that danced around the trees. I could barely breathe as they surrounded the man, whispering in hushed tones. The air grew thick with tension, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was sure they had come for him. I squeezed Jenna's hand, fear tightening its grip on us. It felt like a nightmare, surreal and horrifying. The figures began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody that resonated through the trees. The man's eyes widened in terror as he struggled against his chains, but it was useless. They closed in around him, and the air turned electric with anticipation. In that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a mix of terror and dread. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, their mask glinting in the lantern light, and I saw the empty eye sockets staring directly at me. I gasped and instinctively ducked lower, but not before I caught a glimpse of something chilling. The man wasn't just a victim, he was one of them. As the figures pulled him into their midst, he transformed before our eyes, joining their ranks, chains wrapping around him like a second skin. They began to move away, dragging him along, their lanterns flickering as they vanished into the darkness. We waited in silence until we were sure they were gone, our hearts still racing. We quietly retraced our steps back to camp, too terrified to speak. When we arrived, I gasped in horror. Our campsite was destroyed, tents slashed, supplies scattered, the fire smoldering, but the worst part was the message etched into the ground and that looked like dirt and ash. You should have joined us. We didn't look back as we packed our things and sprinted to the car, desperate to escape the forest grip. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the chains rattling in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the shadows. The evening sun was sinking below the horizon as I patrolled the forest trails, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the isolation and beauty of the deep woods, but tonight felt different. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around dusk, I received a call on the radio about a family camping a few miles from my current position. They reported strange noises surrounding their tent. The mother sounded terrified, insisting it was something big prowling just beyond their campsite. I assured her I would head over immediately. After a quick check of my gear, I set off down the narrow trail. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beams whole. As I trekked onward, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept my radio on, hoping to stay in touch with the family as I approached. When I reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The family's tent was pitched in a small clearing, but there were no signs of life. My heart raced as I called out to them. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I stepped closer and peered inside the tent, but it was empty. The sleeping bags lay undisturbed, and the gear was neatly packed. Something twisted in my gut as I wondered where they could be. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees nearby. I jumped, spinning around with my flashlight aimed into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through me. I yelled for the family, hoping they would respond, but only the wind answered. I decided to check the surrounding area. I took a few steps into the trees when I heard it, a low growl, rumbling and guttural. It sent chills down my spine. I felt like prey in a predator's territory. I called again, my voice trembling, but there was still no response. I was alone. The growling grew louder, closer. I turned to run back to the clearing, but I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and frantically searched for the light. As I reached for it, I felt something brush against my arm. Panic gripped me, and I recoiled, heart racing. The flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, and as I turned, I saw it. A massive creature stood just a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the light like two glowing coals. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. A deep growl emanated from its throat, vibrating in the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature lunged toward me. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I sprinted back to the tent, desperately calling for the family as I ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. I burst into the clearing, and to my shock, I found the family emerging from the trees, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked like they had been running too. I quickly waved them over and led them back to their tent. We huddled together, and I explained what I had seen. Just then, we heard the growl again, closer this time. We scrambled into the tent, my heart pounding as I pulled the flap shut. The creature's claws scraped against the tent fabric, and I felt its weight pressing against the structure. It felt like it was toying with us, waiting for us to show ourselves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creature stopped. Silence enveloped us. We waited, holding our breath, unsure of what to expect. After a long moment, the family's youngest child whispered, "Where did it go?" I took a deep breath and slowly opened the tent flap. Peering out, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished. As we stumbled out into the moonlight, I noticed something strange on the ground, a footprint, but not a normal one. It was human-sized and oddly shaped, as if someone had been standing there all along. I turned to the family, and their faces mirrored my shock. What had chased us? Where had it gone? We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The true horror of the night was not the creature itself, but the fact that it could take on the form of a human. It could be anyone, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting group to stumble upon its domain. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner. As if someone had left in a hurry, my instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year. The vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods, as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. As we gathered around the fire, I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light, its movements slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the woods, but nothing could prepare me for that particular night in late October. The air was crisp, and the trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels against the moonlight. I had just finished a routine check of the campgrounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. It caught my eye because it was unusual. Most campers were already tucked away in their tents by this hour. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight and set off toward the light. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as I walked deeper into the trees. With each step, a sense of unease crept in. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the trunks, illuminating the gnarled branches that twisted like skeletal fingers. As I got closer, I could see the light was coming from a clearing. It pulsed and flickered as if something was wrong with it. When I finally stepped into the clearing, my heart sank. In the center stood a small campfire, but there were no tents, no campers, just the fire, sputtering in the chilly night air. I scanned the area, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It was too quiet, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just the fire crackling, and an overwhelming sense of dread enveloping me. Then I saw a figure darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath hitched in my throat. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure moved too fast, too erratically to be human. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it vanished before I could catch a glimpse. Deciding to investigate further, I edged toward the fire. The flickering light illuminated something unusual at the edge of the flames, a backpack. I knelt down to inspect it, and as I reached for the zipper, I heard a low growl behind me. My heart raced as I whipped around, flashlight raised. The beam landed on the same figure from before, now standing just outside the light. It was tall, hunched, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixated on me. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming for me to run. The growl intensified, and in a panic, I bolted back toward the trail. I could hear it following me, its breath ragged and heavy as it closed the distance. I didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. Just as I thought I might be free, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my knee as I scrambled to my feet. The creature was close now, its growl echoing in the stillness. I took off again, adrenaline surging through my veins, ignoring the throb in my leg. I could hear the rustling of leaves, branches snapping underfoot, but I didn't dare to look back. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the main path. The familiar surroundings were a brief comfort, but the creature was still behind me. I sprinted towards the ranger station, my breath coming in ragged gasps, praying I'd make it in time. As I reached the station, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, heart pounding. I grabbed the radio to call for help, but was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing once more. The knocking came again, but this time it was gentle, almost pleading. I peered through the window. My eyes widened in disbelief. Standing at the door was a child, maybe 10 years old, wearing a tattered jacket. "Help me, please," she said, voice shaking. I quickly unlocked the door and let her in, confusion swirling in my mind. "Where are your parents?" I asked, glancing back toward the woods, half expecting the creature to appear. She pointed toward the forest. "They're lost." I heard something bad. I ran. Before I could respond, the radio crackled to life. "This is dispatch. We received a call about a missing child. Do you copy?" My stomach dropped. The child before me wasn't a lost camper. She was part of the missing family, and the creature wasn't after me. It was trying to protect her. I turned to look back outside, just as the growl echoed once more through the trees. I now understood what had happened. The woods were alive with a danger I could barely comprehend, and I had unwittingly walked into the middle of it. The child was safe for now, but the true terror of the forest was still lurking just outside. The autumn sun had already dipped behind the treetops when I arrived at the remote campsite. I was the only park ranger on duty, and the silence of the forest felt heavy. I had always loved the peace of the woods, but that night, an unsettling feeling crept in like the chill of the evening air. I had just finished my evening rounds when a family of 4 set up camp nearby. They were cheerful and excited, their laughter echoing through the trees. I introduced myself and reminded them to keep food stored properly to avoid any wildlife encounters. They laughed it off, the father joking that they were just going to eat s'mores anyway. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, as darkness enveloped the forest, I started my night shift, equipped with my flashlight and radio. The trees loomed larger, their shadows stretching like fingers across the ground. A gust of wind rustled the leaves, making the night feel alive, as if it were watching. The radio crackled to life, interrupting the eerie quiet. It was the father from the nearby campsite. His voice trembled as he reported strange noises outside their tent. I assured him that it was probably just a deer or a raccoon and that they should stay inside. After I hung up, I couldn't help but glance toward their campsite. The tent was dark, but I could see faint shadows moving inside. A few minutes later, I decided to check on them, wanting to ease their minds. As I walked closer, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. My heart raced. I approached the tent cautiously, shining my flashlight toward the sound. When suddenly I heard the father scream, I ran toward the tent, calling out to the family. The air felt electric, charged with fear. I reached the tent, and the father burst out, eyes wide and panicked. He shouted about something in the woods, something big. Before I could calm him down, I heard it. A low growl, unlike anything had ever encountered, reverberated through the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I ordered the family to stay close to me. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The growl echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was followed by unsettling silence, as if the forest held its breath. Suddenly, something darted between the trees. A glimpse of movement caught my eye. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. I turned to the family, urging them to stay quiet and remain alert. Just as I began to feel a sense of control, the ground shook beneath us. A massive figure emerged from the trees, towering and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a menacing light. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. The father grabbed his children, pulling them back toward me. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar. In a panic, I turned to run, dragging the family with me. We sprinted back toward the campsite, my flashlight flickering as the creature pursued us. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding behind us, each step a reminder that we had to escape. I led them to a clearing, hoping to find safety in the open space. As we reached the clearing, the creature stopped abruptly, as if it had hit an invisible wall. We halted in confusion, panting heavily. The father, breathing heavily, asked why it had stopped. I didn't know. I aimed my flashlight at the creature, and as the beam landed on it, the glow of its eyes flickered out. Suddenly, a blinding light enveloped the clearing, illuminating everything around us. The creature vanished. I blinked, disoriented. The family looked at me, fear still etched on their faces. I assured them we were safe, but deep down, I was shaken. As we made our way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. The ground was undisturbed, no signs of the chase we had just experienced. We packed up quickly and returned to the park entrance. I glanced back one last time at the woods, where shadows danced in the fading light. I would never forget that night or the creature we never truly saw, and I would never understand what happened in that clearing. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the deeper parts of the woods where few ventured. I loved the solitude, the way the trees enveloped me like a protective embrace. But on one chilly October evening, that solitude took on a sinister edge. I was finishing my last round before heading back to the ranger station. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. I had my radio tuned to the channel that connected me with other rangers, and as I walked, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. A family camping nearby reported hearing strange noises. The father described it as a low growl, followed by something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced. I assured him I'd head their way and investigate. The family was about 1.5 miles from where I was. I picked up my pace, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. As I neared their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, tall and ancient, creaked as the wind picked up. I could almost feel them watching me, the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of my light. When I finally arrived, the tent stood eerily still. I called out to the family, but there was no answer. Anxiety twisted my stomach as I unzipped the tent flap. Inside, the sleeping bags were neatly folded, and personal items were still scattered about. But no one was there. Just then, I heard a deep, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. It sent a chill down my spine. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and my beam fell on a large figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its silhouette was too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes, my God, the eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. I felt my instinct scream at me to run. I took a step back, and that seemed to provoke it. The figure stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath its weight. I bolted. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms as I navigated the darkened path. Behind me, I could hear it following, moving with a speed that defied nature. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath as I raced toward the ranger station. When I arrived, I quickly grabbed my radio and called for backup. I relayed everything I'd seen, though my words felt jumbled and frantic. A few minutes later, another ranger arrived. We decided to head back to the campsite together, flashlights in hand. As we approached, I felt a mix of dread and relief. I wasn't alone anymore. The air was colder now, the forest seemingly holding its breath. We found the campsite just as I had left it, except now. A tent flap rustled gently in the breeze. My fellow ranger and I called out again, but still no answer. With a growing sense of foreboding, we shone our lights around, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a prickle of panic. The figure could be nearby. We decided to search the area, staying close to one another. As we scoured the perimeter, I noticed something out of place on the ground, a set of deep, claw-like tracks leading away from the tent. They looked disturbingly human, but with elongated fingers that should not exist. I followed the tracks, my heart racing. They led to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a dark, swirling mist. It felt wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, from the mist, a figure emerged. I recoiled, shining my flashlight at it, but as the beam illuminated the figure, I froze. It was the family, standing perfectly still, their faces blank and eyes wide. They weren't moving, but their bodies seemed to ripple, as if made of smoke. I stumbled backward, gasping as the mist began to close in around me. The ranger grabbed my arm, pulling me away. We ran back to the campsite, leaving the mist and the eerie figures behind. When we finally reached the ranger station, I turned to look back at the clearing. It was gone. The family, the mist, everything had vanished as if it never existed. We reported it, but when the authorities searched the area, there was nothing, no tracks, no signs of the family. It was as if they were swallowed by the forest. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night was more than a mere shadow. It lingers in the depths of the woods, waiting, watching. The park reopened, but I can never bring myself to go back to that part of the woods. The shadows seem to whisper secrets I am too afraid to hear. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. The stars overhead shine brightly, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor. But there are times when that beauty feels sinister. One October night, my shift began like any other, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. I was out on the usual trail, checking campsites and making sure everything was in order. The air was crisp, and the wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I had just finished my rounds when I got a call on the radio from a couple camping a few miles deeper in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent, things that sounded like whispers and shuffling feet. I told them I would head over immediately, assuring them it was probably just the wind. As I hiked through the dense underbrush, unease settled in my stomach. The noises they described didn't sit well with me. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the gnarled roots and thick brush. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight flickered intermittently, and I mentally cursed the batteries. Finally, I reached the couple's campsite. Their tent was pitched, but eerily quiet. I called out to them, but there was no response. I approached the tent and carefully unzipped it. Peering inside, it was empty. Sleeping bags were still rolled up, their belongings neatly stowed, but they were nowhere to be found. My heart raced. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or distress. That's when I heard it, a low growl, reverberating through the trees. I felt it in my bones, a primal sound that struck fear into my heart. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest was still, but I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor creeping in. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement behind a nearby tree. I shined my flashlight toward it. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It looked like a man, but was unnaturally thin, almost emaciated. His skin glimmered in the flashlight's beam, pale and sickly. He held a hand up as if trying to shield himself from the light. But what struck me were his eyes. They were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling mix of fear and hunger. I stumbled back, my breath quickening as I fought the urge to scream. The man stepped forward, and I could see he was not quite right. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the growl still echoing behind me. I darted through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop to look back, driven by instinct. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow morphing into something sinister. I finally reached the main path and sprinted toward my truck, fumbling with my keys as I desperately tried to get the engine to start. Just as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, illuminated by my headlights. But as I drove away, my pulse racing, I realized I hadn't seen him alone. I had glimpsed the couple huddled behind him, their eyes wide with terror, as if they were under some kind of spell. I returned to the ranger station and reported everything. We launched a search team back into the woods, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the couple. The area was as quiet as it had been when I first found the tent. The park was deemed safe, but I knew what I had seen. The ranger community brushed it off as a story, a figment of my imagination after being out in the woods too long. Years later, I still hear whispers when the wind howls through the trees. I've moved on, taking a different job away from the woods, but something lingers in my mind. I wonder if the couple ever made it out. Or perhaps they are still there, trapped in that darkness, forever watching the woods for the next park ranger who dares to venture too close. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods with friends. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life. I drove us deep into the forest, the road narrowing until it became a mere trail. The trees towered over us, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. As we set up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving an eerie twilight that seemed to cloak the world in mystery. After a hearty dinner, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The flames danced, illuminating our faces and casting long shadows on the trees. My friends, Yena, Matt, and Aaron, were all in high spirits, but I felt a strange unease creeping in. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if they were holding their breath. Yena suggested we go for a night hike. She had a way of always being the bravest among us, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Reluctantly, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and venturing into the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the narrow path ahead, but the darkness quickly swallowed everything beyond. As we walked, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. About a half-mile in, we heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It stopped us in our tracks. My heart raced, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Matt suggested we investigate, and against my better judgment, we moved toward the sound. As we crept through the underbrush, we stumbled upon a clearing. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center, were chains linked to a massive tree stump. The chains were rusted and old, and next to them lay a small lantern flickering weakly. Panic surged through me, but before I could suggest we turn back, we heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. We strained to listen, and then we saw them. Figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadow, moving closer. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and they were holding lanterns. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were dragging chains behind them. The same sound we had heard moments before. We froze, hearts pounding, as they approached the lantern. There were at least 5 of them, silent and ominous, and I could feel a primal urge to run. Yena, however, whispered for us to stay hidden. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but the combination of fear and curiosity rooted me in place. Suddenly, one of the figures turned sharply, shining a lantern in our direction. Light flooded the area, and for a split second, I could see its face, a pale mask, expressionless and hollow. The sight sent me into a panic, and I grabbed Gina's arm, urging her to run. We bolted through the trees, the sound of chains clanking behind us as the figures began to follow. We sprinted back to camp, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with the image of those masked figures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. As we reached our campsite, we stopped, looking for signs of life. The fire had gone cold, and the area was eerily quiet, but something was off. Our tents were still standing, yet everything felt wrong. In the center of our campsite, engraved in the ground, was a message: "You shouldn't have come here." The letters were crude, as if scratched by something sharp and heavy. Panic surged again, and we scrambled to gather our belongings, adrenaline fueling our movements. Just as we finished packing, we heard the chains again, much closer this time. I glanced toward the tree line and saw the flicker of lanterns. We dashed to the car, fumbling with the keys. Our hearts racing, we jumped inside, slamming the doors as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out of the campsite. As we sped down the trail, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures stood at the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting an eerie glow in the darkness. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was no one there. The figures had vanished, yet the lanterns still flickered ominously. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We weren't running from something in the woods. We had been lured here, and now something had marked us, watching from the darkness. The sense of dread settled in as we drove away, knowing we would never return to those woods again. I was fresh out of ranger training when I was assigned to one of the most remote sections of the forest. It was early fall, and the trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves. Most visitors had left for the season, which suited me just fine. I loved the quiet. The stillness of the woods gave me time to reflect, but that peace was about to be shattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call on my radio about a family who had set up camp deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. I had been patrolling the area, so I decided to check on them. The trail was familiar, but darkness descended quickly, and my flashlight seemed to struggle against the thickening shadows. As I approached their campsite, I heard a low, unsettling growl echoing through the trees. My heart raced. I knew bears were common in these woods, but this was different. The growl had an unnatural quality, a resonance that felt almost human. I quickened my pace, muscles tense, flashlight flickering against the growing darkness. When I reached their campsite, the family's tent was pitched but empty. The fire was still smoldering, and scattered belongings lay haphazardly around. I called out, my voice shaking, but only silence answered. I stepped into the tent, and everything looked normal at first. But then I noticed something odd. Deep claw marks scored the ground outside the entrance, as if something had been pacing there, anxious and agitated. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step back, scanning the area for any sign of the family. That's when I heard the growl again, now louder and closer. I whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I caught a glimpse of something shifting in the shadows, tall, thin, and impossibly elongated. It had a human shape, but was far too lanky to be anything recognizable. I felt an instinctual urge to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I managed to force my legs into motion and bolted back toward the trail. Behind me, the creature let out a piercing scream that echoed through the trees, sending a shockwave of terror through me. I didn't look back. I raced down the path, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it following me, fast and silent, like the wind itself. Just as I reached a clearing, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight rolled away, extinguishing itself in the dirt. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, barely registering the sounds of the forest around me. The growling had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that engulfed the clearing. I stumbled toward my flashlight, breathless and terrified. As I grabbed it and turned it back on, I aimed the beam into the trees. My stomach dropped as I saw the creature standing at the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It wasn't advancing. It just stood there, watching me. Then, without warning, The creature turned and dashed into the darkness, moving faster than I could comprehend. Confusion flooded my mind. What was it doing? I took a step back, heart still racing, when suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Ranger, over here." I spun around to see a group of campers emerging from the brush. Their faces were pale, and I could see the fear in their eyes. They told me they had witnessed the creature too, that they had been camping nearby and had fled when they saw it approach their tent. They confirmed that the family was safe, just a short distance away. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I tried to explain what had happened, the growl and the chase, but their eyes widened in horror as they listened. I could sense their disbelief and fear, but the fact remained that we all survived the night. Later, when I returned to the ranger station, I filed my report and shared the details with my supervisor. He listened intently, then leaned in closer. "Did you get a good look at it?" he asked. I nodded, still shaken. He sighed, a knowing look on his face. "Rangers in this area have seen it before. We call it the Watcher. No one knows what it is or where it comes from. Just be glad it didn't decide to come closer." A chill settled deep in my bones as I realized that what I had seen might not have been a random encounter, but part of a much darker reality hidden in the woods. The forest had its secrets, and I was just beginning to scratch the surface. Camping in the woods had always been a cherished tradition among my friends and me. This trip, however, felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, and even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. We set up camp. 4 of us, Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I. As night descended, the atmosphere grew thick with an unsettling tension. After dinner, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to take a walk. Yena suggested we explore the woods under the moonlight, laughing nervously about how spooky it would be. Fueled by the thrill of adventure and maybe a little fear, we agreed. With flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the trees, the path illuminated only by the beams of our lights. Initially, we were caught up in the beauty of the night, the shimmering stars above and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the branches. But soon, the sounds of the forest began to change. A distant rustle, a snap of a twig, and the uncomfortable feeling that something was watching us settled in. The further we walked, the heavier the air felt around us. Then we heard it, a soft clanking, like metal against metal, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. It seemed to be coming from the direction we had just walked, and in a moment of collective panic, we decided to hide. We ducked behind some thick bushes, our breaths shallow as we strained to hear more. What we saw next made my blood run cold. Lanterns appeared in the distance, bobbing along the forest floor, illuminating the space between the trees. Figures emerged, draped in tattered white clothing, their faces hidden behind eerie masks that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Chains rattled as they walked, shackles on their wrists and ankles clanking with every step. The procession moved slowly, the figures gliding toward our hiding spot as if they were drawn by an unseen force. My friends and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, a shared understanding of our predicament settling over us. We remained completely still, our hearts pounding in sync, the tension thick enough to slice through as they passed. I could see their eyes, or rather, where their eyes should have been. The masks were hollow, devoid of any expression, and I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, but managed to suppress it. The figures moved with a haunting grace, and I wondered if they even knew we were there. They continued on, fading into the depths of the woods, leaving us shaken and terrified. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we dared to move. Finally, we crept back to our camp, only to find it in disarray. The tents were overturned, and the fire pit was smoldering as if it had just been extinguished. Fear twisted in my stomach as we approached the campsite. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I noticed something on the ground, half hidden by the leaves. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Scrawled in the dirt was a message: "You should not have come here." We all froze, the weight of that ominous sentence hanging heavily in the air. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, suffocating and relentless. We hastily gathered our things, adrenaline fueling our movements, and sprinted back to the car. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves had us glancing over our shoulders, terrified of what might be lurking in the shadows. Once inside the car, We locked the doors and started the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees, the place where we had just been. That's when I saw them, those figures standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated by the moonlight. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us leave. Later that night, once we were safely back in the city, I checked my phone. A notification lit up the screen. It was a message from Yana, sent while we were in the woods. "Did you see them? They're in the trees. They know we're here." I stared at the screen, confusion washing over me. Had she seen them too? I quickly typed back, asking her what she meant. I stared at the message, waiting for her response, but the screen went dark. Then, I heard it again, the faint clanking of chains in my mind, echoing, haunting. It wasn't over. The woods were not finished with us yet.